Hello and welcome to the Dev Talk for patches 2.07 and 2.071. I am doing these together since 2.071 has a lot of fixes for things that were in 2.07, so it made sense, since these patches are relatively close together in terms of release timing, to just do a single Dev Talk talking about both of them together rather than separate ones. I am also doing this one alone, since everyone on the dev team is currently busy with either life or other projects. So, without any further ado, let's get to it. So, a few basic changes that were kind of mostly quality of life things and basic balancing. First one is, it was brought to our attention that some of the timing and costs of listening posts were off, so we decided to standardize most of those. Where, for example, Space Marine was a big outlier, where it would take 45 seconds to build a listening post compared to the 30 that was standard for most. And the Orc one cost a lot less than the others, despite having a inbuilt turret before you even get any of the upgrades, which was weird, but hey. So it was brought up in requisition to the standard cost of 90, and IG one was also a tad too expensive. Then, and one of the major reworks that was introduced during this patch was a rework to the commanders. So there is no longer two tiers of stuff, it's all a single tier. They all become available at Commander level 6. They're all standardized to 100, and some of them were buffed. So like the squad and support caps were buffed to give +6, where before there were two tiers of +2. And this one will come back to with 2.071. because this change did not work properly, so for now we reverted it whilst we look for a better solution. And Commander Aura level 8 gave a boost and can now stack on multiple commanders and with a larger range. So, looking at some of the win condition changes. Some new win conditions were added. Berserk AI, which gives the AI some buffs. It gives them a production speed buff, some extra resource, just everything the AI could want. When this was first released in 2.07, there was actually a bug with AI. Any sort of rapid speed or anything that increased the production speed for some reason screwed with the AI's build order, so that has been fixed in 2.071, so this should actually make the AI stronger, where ironically in 2.07 it made the AI a bit weaker because of the fact that they didn't use a proper build order like they were supposed to. Another thing to note is that as of 2.071, this and rapid speed will cause a slight lag spike, like 20 seconds into the game. This is the workaround that we had to do in order to make sure that it works properly for the AI. So the buff doesn't work for the first 20 seconds, and then it gets enabled 20-ish seconds in. Another win condition is enabling Honor Guard. What this does is adds a building in Skirmish to every faction, which enables them to build Honor Guard from that faction, from that building. This is mostly for us as developers to be able to test Honor Guard strength and compare them and fight them against each other without having to go through the grueling task of getting them all in campaign. You can just get them in Skirmish and compare them. These are not meant to be balanced. Their cost and everything is just completely all over the place. But yeah, this is mostly for fun, so if you want to play with some of the campaign units, go for it. So, Aid Fast Attack has been reworked to give you a balanced selection of fast tier 0 units. and Rebalance Titans has been majorly reworked so that it actually does what the description says it does, because before the description would claim that it does certain things when it didn't, and all of that. Then, win conditions that increase and decrease resource rates were fixed to include all secondary resources. What this means is that they before would only affect requisition and power, but now they should affect faith and souls as well. And obviously relic is its own thing, so that's just staying as is. And similarly, Rebalance Fortress, Commander Structure have all been fixed to fit their description. Updated the Crucible list so that everything that should get all of these different buffs does get them. And upgraded the Restrict Grenades cooldown, those are pretty self-explanatory. And then a few changes to the Hero's Win condition as well. So, some of the major things. So, Orc Stronghold Scars and AI errors fixed. There's a lot of... there were a lot of problems with the Orc Stronghold, and if you're wondering, there was some problems with a portion of these fixes not actually happening in 2.07, and some of these fixes were meant to go out in 2.06, but that they were lost in everything else, so they were implemented at 2.07. But yeah, the Orc Stronghold was a bit buggy, where save and loading would break it, and there were some prominent AI errors as well. Most of those should be fixed as of the current patch. And some pathfinding fixes on some of the campaign maps, pretty self-explanatory. And this is an interesting one, where some of the war gear for campaign was just very boring. It just didn't do much, so this was a small little project of mine where I wanted to give each commander some sort of either interesting ability or some sort of capstone, so that you can feel them go up in power as you get all of their war gear. So to go through some of them. So CSM did not get anything because they already have the capstone of turning you into a giant fuck-off demon. So they didn't need any buffs or changes. The Archaon Haywire Grenade was very underwhelming, so instead I decided to make it a once per battle ability. What this means is that it has an insanely long cooldown, so you're only realistically going to get it once off in a fight. But it's quite powerful. I recommend that you get it and try it for yourself. It's fun. And then you'll see this for both Eldar and Necrons, where they did not get any buffs necessarily, but their abilities were changed to where if you have certain campaign war gears, it will enable you to cast those abilities without having to get the add-on. You can still get the add-ons, but what this allows you is to have certain abilities right off the bat without having to spend the resources on the hero levels or on the cost of the add-ons themselves. You just have them, and the requirements for the research trees for both of the research trees were reworked to where war gear that requires a lot of other war gear enables some of the more powerful abilities up to like the level 6 abilities. General's Capstone, which is the Ibram's Vestment, now gives you the Emperor's Speech ability. You can still get it through the in-game upgrade, but as with the other two, this just enables you to have it as a baseline at the start of a game. So once you get all of the war gear, you can just nuke morale at the start of a game for the entire map, which is pretty fun. Similar idea for the war boss, where the boss pole is significantly stronger, but it now requires all other war gear, so it basically works as a capstone now for the orcs. Canoness, again, its capstone now has a once per battle Divine Slaughter ability, which will just deal massive damage to all units around the Canoness. And Force Commander now changes to the Chapter Master when you get all of the war gear. So yeah, basic idea here is that most commanders should either have an interesting ability or something to look forward to once you've gained all of the researches. So moving on to the faction changes. The sub-faction choices that were tier 0 were moved to tier 1 and given a bit of a cost. This is to prevent the tier 0 buffs, the buffs that just picking the gods would give, from being too strong in tier 0. They made some of the units a bit overtuned, so they had to be moved to tier 1. And the cost is to make it a little bit costly to choose sub-factions early, rather than being an instant pick for buffs. Another change was that the sub-faction researches were changed in their cost balance, where instead of costing the same requisition and power, they were changed to having their power cost and adding an equivalent amount to their requisition cost, where usually a general rule of thumb is that requisition to power is a 2-to-1 ratio. So if you take away 100 power, that equates to 200 requisition. So for 200, we took away 100 power, but added 200 requisition onto the thing. The idea here is that because of how power hungry these researchers were, it disincentivized using the vehicle units that they buffed, which was a shame because the vehicle units usually got instantaneous buffs, like buffs that affected the unit straight away, whilst the infantry units usually needed to either get weapons or leaders or something in order to gain major benefits from the sub-faction research. So we wanted to encourage the use of some of the vehicle units early, as soon as you're able to get these researches. Some general balance changes to the Moritat kill team. They were a bit, well, not I say a bit, they were quite a bit overtuned. So Lord of Change was a bit overtuned with the tier 5 recharge rate, where it was too short to the point where it was unreasonable to even use their abilities, where they would constantly be off cooldown. So we decided to pull back on that a little bit and instead just give it more baseline stats. So there should be a buff to it, because before the cooldowns were just too short to the point where they were pointless. So another change was that the researches are locked if you select opposite gods, and when we talk about 2.071, also the cultist worship is locked. So there's been some turbulence in the Discord about just picking all 4 gods rather than picking any individual ones, and we decided to nerf, since that's very much a bug with the engine of the game that we're not really able to fix. We decided to nerf and discourage that kind of strategy. Practicus Coven needed a little bit of a buff, so some of their cooldowns were reduced, and they're now able to go into transports and be deep striked and capture points. Warp Speeder was causing crashes, so funnily enough, this wasn't actually fully fixed in 2.07. You'll see in 2.071 there's another thing that says that this has finally been fixed. This has been an issue for a few patches now, and I finally figured out why this was happening and was able to fix it in 2.071, but yeah, as of 2.07 it still caused crashes, which is unfortunate. Kern and Nurgle Terminators were given morale. They were a bit too strong just without having any sort of morale, and I wanted to make the Zinj Terminators a bit more unique. and the Phoenix Guard just had way too much morale to the point where they basically had infinite morale, so that was nerfed a bit as well. But to compensate, the champion Khorne Berserker... Oh, sorry, this is the Khorne Berserker. Yeah, so the Khorne Berserker gives their squad a bit more morale. The Khorne Berserkers were a bit too easy to run out of morale and for them to become basically ineffective as a result, so this should make them a bit more sticky in a fight. The Testudo Transport was a bit too cheap and a bit too good at what it does, so its cost was buffed by 2020 and health reduced by a bit. And this is also, you'll see when we go down to Space Marines, where there was a lot of buildings that had very weird build times, where the HQs for CSM, which, you know, the faction with forced labor who can build buildings faster than anyone else, for some reason their HQs were taking half the time to build than other factions, which was weird, so that's been brought in line, and same with the Dark Mechanicus Gate, but this was brought in line with other Titan factories. General bug fixes. A lot of the Eldar stuff is general bug fixes. Feel free to read over it. Since most of these changes were Iskalias, I'm not going to go through them as I don't have an insight as to the reasoning as to why these were changed. But I've read through most of them, and most of them seem fairly self-explanatory. So, Imperial Guard. Their early game needed a little bit of tweaking, where it's not that it was weak, but some aspects of it were overly punishing. So, Riders were fixed to where their recruitment cost now matches their reinforce cost, where they're cheaper to get out in the early game now. Special weapon teams were a bit weird, where recruiting them was way too cheap, but reinforcing them was way too expensive, so we just kind of found a middle ground there. And this is the major one, where a lot of the time getting a weapon on guardsmen or special weapon teams was more expensive than getting another unit, which for big squads that can easily die was quite awkward, where if you were to start losing models with special weapons, that really hurt you. And unlike tabletop, you can't protect your squads with your models with special weapons by getting rid of other models and choosing which models die. So if you were unlucky, your squads would be made ineffective and you would lose a shit ton of resources. So we decided to make the weapon cost for them a bit cheaper, as to make the getting weapons on them early a bit more viable. Another thing is that the HQ was just way too strong. This caused some builds where people would just rush a HQ in the middle of the map to try to basically slow turret push the enemy, because the HQ just dealt so much damage with even conscripts in there. So what we decided to do is that the more powerful weapons, being the plasma and the heavy bolters on the HQ, and the more powerful weapon on the barracks as well, were locked behind some upgrades. So they're locked behind, I think, the plasma. I don't remember which one is which, but if I'm remembering this correctly, the plasma is now locked behind the Tech Priest Veteran upgrade. That's the upgrade that makes your engine seers better. And the heavy bolters are locked behind the artillery doctrine. What this means is that you do not have access to these tools until you are a bit into tier 1 or maybe even tier 2. And this is to encourage an aggressive playstyle rather than just using HQs and barracks to jump conscripts forward and kill your opponent that way, which was very frustrating to play against, especially as some factions like Necrons, for example, couldn't do anything against this. similar to CSM, there were a lot of buildings for Space Marines that were built way too slow. I swear, I don't know what was going on, but I feel someone in UA had just a bias against Space Marines, or, you know, since they were too strong for other reasons, they were overly nerfed, where a lot of their build speeds have consistently just been too slow, and a lot of their costs were consistently way too high for what makes sense. You may note, if you go back through the patches, there's a lot of just buffing Space Marines to bring them in line with other factions. And this is another one of those, where HQ speed was way too slow, so that's been buffed, and a lot of their buildings were way too slow to build as well, so that's been buffed to bring them in line with other factions, and specifically stuff like CSM, since they are mirrors of each other. So the Basilisk for Imperial Fists was too cheap and too quick to get out, so it was nerfed in how much, especially for a tier 2 artillery unit, it was way too easy to spam and made it very difficult to deal with. So they were made quite a bit more expensive and slower to build, so that you could not get as many out of them as quickly. And then some of the Emperor's Armory upgrades did not work properly, so they were fixed to match their descriptions. So Tau, pretty self-explanatory. Anti-structure pens for breachers were a bit too high. The whole experiment that we did with having swapping back and forth weapon with crisis suits, unfortunately due to engine limitations, none of what we tried really worked out the way we wanted to. So instead we decided to just split the squads into two and have two separate specializations, where you had the standard crisis suits, which are longer ranged, better on the move, and higher speed, but less survivable. And the brawler variant, which has a bit of a different specialization in terms of pens and has a bit more health. And then the Sunfire and Crisis hazard suits were nerfed a little bit so that they're not nearly as spammable, or as early, where and if you lose these buildings, you lose access to those weapons. So Tyranids are the reason why this patch was called 2.07 rather than 2.061. And that's because despite only being a few lines, this is a major rework to how basically everything about the Tyranids works. And it's worth its own kind of detailed discussion. So we'll go into game for this. Apologies about the noises. So, first major thing with the Tyranids. If you are to look at the Brood Hive, it actually gives you a description of the Master and Thrall mechanic. I could not think of a good place to explain this in game, so this is on the production building that produces most of your units. So, Master and Thrall mechanic. Thrall units have low morale, which decreases accuracy and movement speed when it breaks. Master units have an aura that makes Thrall units unable to take morale damage. Warning, when a Master bottle dies, the Synapse backlash damages all nearby Thrall units. So that's the basic idea, where let me show it off as the Gene Stealers. So I'll have the Gene Stealers moving back and forth. And let's run them out of morale with the Grenadiers. As you can see, they are both moving slower, and they would be doing less damage if they were attacking anything. And this will last for a while until their morale comes back. However, if I'm to get a Hive Tyrant and put it near the units, then as you can see, they do not take morale damage anymore at all. And their movement speed has in general been buffed by the Synapse. So But if a Synapse unit dies, it does damage and knocks back any Thrall units around it. And that's the basic idea, where Tyranids were way too strong in early game pushes, and this is a way to kind of remedy or nerf that a bit, where they are no longer as oppressive in the early game, since most of the units that were really oppressive, like the Termagant and especially the Hormagant, now have 100 morale and are very easy to run out of morale if you don't have a Hive Tyrant or another Master unit near them. They're still strong and you can still be aggressive with them, but you need to be more careful and spend extra resources to make sure that they're safe. One thing to note with this is that defensively, the Tyranid units are still strong by themselves because all buildings, including listening posts, do give them morale. So defensively, you're still able to defend yourself even without any master units, but offensively, you're going to be a lot weaker without them. That's the basic idea. Curb their offensive power whilst not nerfing them all that much on the defense, and yeah. So, another thing to note that you've probably noticed is that all of the units are in here, and there are no units in the Gaunt Hive. This is intentional, since this will be your kind of Tyranid building, and the Gaunt Hive is going to be a building for the sub-factions, specifically Genestealer cult sub-factions. So for now, because Tyranids have so few units, I decided to merge a lot of their buildings together and free up the other buildings for the extra units that they will get with the sub-factions. So yeah, this now houses all of your early game Tyranid units up until tier 2. Obviously, except for the ones that are in the HQ. To quickly go through some of the units, Lictor Alpha, apart from being a master unit, hasn't really changed. Zoanthrope hasn't really changed, apart from being a master unit. Spinegaunt's not changed much, apart from being Thrall and having morale. Termagants, Hormagants, and Gargoyles, they've had some interesting changes to them, specifically due to the fact that they have this section that says additional pens after upgrade. This, I won't go into detail with this since I'll be doing a full Tyranid guide at some point when the Genestealers are implemented, but the basic idea is that as you get certain researchers in the gestation pod, they will change their weapons to have additional pens versus certain types. So the Termagant will be good versus Commanders, Light Vehicles, and Titans, and the Hormagant will be good versus Commanders, Light Buildings, and Living Metal. And the Gargoyles will get pens versus demons and morale. So this is just to make the units have longevity by giving them certain niche purposes. Lictor, mostly unchanged except for the fact that it's a Thrall unit, so if it runs out of morale, you cannot as easily escape because it will halve its speed, and I'm pretty sure they were buffed because they were way too strong before, obviously, not having any morale and being super quick, but because they have morale and are a very high risk, high reward unit, because a single stun grenade can just stop them in their tracks and then they're basically dead, they were buffed quite significantly. Ravener hasn't changed all that much except for being a Thrall unit, but they will get independent later on as I show off some of the interesting researches. Warrior, this is your only infantry master unit, which makes sense because warriors on tabletop and just in general lore are synapse creatures for Tyranids. So they are your infantry master unit if you're going with a lot of other similar infantry. Broodlord hasn't changed all that much except for the additional pens thing. Spore Cluster hasn't changed much. It still has morale to make it easier to counter them, but not much apart from that, and Biovores, in the end, not much has changed. So the interesting part are the researches, where they were divided into multiple trees, where you have Gaunts, then you have Infiltrators, which in this case is lumping Gene Stealers and Lictors together. And then you have Warrior researches, and which are your Raveners, Warriors, and Broodlords. And then you have Zoanthrope and Biovores lumped in together, and some additional researches here. So the basic idea is that you have 3-ish playstyles that you can go for in the early game, where you can go for Gaunts and Hive Tyrant, which kind of makes sense because they're around the same speed. The Hive Tyrant is a little bit slower, but he can generally keep up, and being super tanky and a single unit means that if you go for Gaunts, the enemy will need to get anti-swarm, but then the Hive Tyrant is a big beefy boy, so they will also, if they want to kill your Synapse creature, they need to get anti-commander as well. So then the other strategy is to go for Infiltrators, and the interesting thing with this is that this Tier 2 research allows them to behave independently. So in Tier 0, you would go for Lictor Alpha plus Lictors and Gene Stealers, and use the Lictor Alpha as your Synapse creature, where because he's infiltrated, you can actually stay in the back, and as long as the enemy doesn't have detection, they won't know what's giving you the morale immunity, and you can just kind of have him sit in the back and provide the Synapse. And then in Tier 2, you can cause them to act independently so that you don't need Masters and can attack from multiple sides with all of these units, and Raveners as well. And then you have the Warrior, which is just a big blob of Raveners and Warriors. You can add Guns in here as well, but then you need to follow 2 research trees. And that's the basic idea, where you have these 3 different playstyles in the early game, and the units scale well into Tier 2, and are still pretty good in Tier 3. Because the Synapse is not just a morale immunity, as you saw, it is also just a general movement speed and other buffs to the units as well. So, in Tier 1, there are no other units currently. There are only researches and the units that are unlocked in here, and that's because Tier 1 is where the Gene Stealer cults will come in, and they will get their own research tree as well. So Tier 2 is when you start getting Carnifexes, where yes, Carnifexes were moved to be Tier 2 and Tier 3 units. And they have their own sets of researches and their own uses, where Halifax and Screamerfax are Tier 2 and have their ranged and melee rolls. And yes, they do still have morale. It's more, it's 500 rather than the 100 of most of the infantry, but they do still have morale, so you need to be careful with that. And then in Tier 3, you gain access to the Tyrant Guard, which were significantly buffed in their role as well, especially with their weapons, and the General Carnifex. And you may note that this building also houses the Tier 3 relic units, and those are your late game masters, where obviously if you get hero upgrades, the Hive Tyrant and the Lictor Alpha and Zoanthropes can still be used, but these are the kind of really tanky master units. So then, as we're moving into, again, Tunnel Warrens is going to be a Gene Stealer cult building for kind of vehicles and stuff like that for Tier 3 stuff. And then Assimilation Chamber houses the Hierophant Biotitan, houses a bunch of the researches that were previously in the Manipulator Hive, and also a bunch of researches for the relic units, where you get them in Tier 3, but you get upgrades for them in Tier 4, where these upgrades only affect all of the Carnifex units, and Tyrant Guard are counted in that. And then you also have the Hierophant Biotitan. So again, since I'm planning to do a detailed video on Tyranids, I'm not going to go over all the researches and all the strategies, but this is the basic idea, where you have Tier 0, you have units. Tier 1, you have some units that are enabled, such as the gargoyles or the warriors, etc., etc. But the main idea is that you're able to make your army viable by just getting the right researches. Then Tier 2, you gain access to some Carnifex. Tier 3, you gain access to more Carnifex. And Tier 4, you gain access to a bunch of the researches. And Gene Stealer Colts will fill in the gaps that are left. So, yeah, that's the basic idea. A Tyrant, Master Thrall mechanic, and then consolidation of a lot of the researches and units for Tyranids, because as you can see, I did not take anything away, by the way. All of the stuff that's here are all existing things. I did not remove anything, but you may note that they all fit into a lot less buildings, to where you have you have 3 buildings for Tyranids which don't have anything, because everything else nicely fits into buildings without even feeling squished. That's how few units Tyranids have. So yeah, and that's basically all for the Tyranids. There was also a slight buff to the digest pool's build speed, because 50 was a bit too long. But that's the basic idea. Moving on to 2.071, more standardization, where listening post vision was a little bit all over the place for different factions. So listening post for normal listening posts vision for normal listening posts is 35 and 5 for keen sight. 35 normal sight, 5 keen sight. And then for Nids and Demons, it's 55 and 10, since their listening posts are a bit different. So there were some bugs in regards to the Necron Destroyer Lord possession, where some units that shouldn't have been able to be possessed were, and some that should be able to weren't, so a lot of fixing that. There was also a bunch of hidden buffs that different tech researches gave, like for example, Imperial Guard would get extra troops for guardsmen in their Tier 1 and Tier 2, and that's still there, but it's now in the description. So a lot of the descriptions were fixed, a lot of the unintended buffs in there were removed, and if there's any intended ones, it says so in the description somewhere. This was the thing that I mentioned earlier, where Rapid Speed and Berserk AI screwed with the AI build order, and now they shouldn't, but they are enabled 20-ish seconds into the game, so you will 20 seconds into a game see a bit of a lag spike as the SCAR gets properly enabled. A lot of AI fixes happened in this patch, but it's kind of hard to give any sort of detail on them. But yeah, there were a lot of fixes to general build order and AI behaviors, and then the Tyranids AI also crashed the game, so that was fixed. Someone pointed out that the Dark Elder Honor Guard Scourges had pink icons, so that was fixed. Another way to disincentivize picking all 4 gods, where the cultists... Oh, sorry, this is Chaos Demons. Sorry, I was thinking the wrong thing. So Chaos Demons only have 4 power researches, and we noticed that they were also weaker than the other factions. So we gave the existing ones a buff, but decided that giving them a 5th one on top would be too much of a buff to them. So for now, it's still 4 power researches, but they are 50% stronger. And Listening Post health was a buff to a bit too much, so that was nerfed as well. Finally, Warp Speeder was fixed. This is where I figured out what exactly was causing it and was able to get rid of it, so it should all be good now. And cultist worship, this is the thing that I started talking about, where cultist worship is now disabled if you pick opposite gods. This is to disincentivize you from using all 4 gods. You still can, but it's not nearly as powerful as it was a few patches ago. Listening posts for Dark Elder were a bit too squishy. Some general fixes. Orcs got a bit of a minor rework where a lot of their weapons had weird penetrations and some of their units just had weird damages and stuff, so we got them properly sorted out where their damage numbers and all of that were properly tested and balanced around each other. So most of the units should have a niche and be useful in that niche, whilst some units should no longer overshadow others. And fixed a few bugs as well. As for Space Marines, there are a few minor changes here where sub-faction weapon, the weapon research now gives the sub-factions a few extra weapons to catch up with the squad reinforcing upgrades that they got. The Predator Executioner was buffed in its health, as it was the same health as, or even I think less health than its longer range counterpart, which made no sense. So now it has now it's tankier to compensate for its shorter range. And there is a minor Land Raider rework where they were given some more distinct roles, where the basic Land Raider is even cheaper and costs less relic, to make it a Jeep Jack-of-all-trades option. Crusader was made slightly shorter to build and speedier, faster. Ares, slightly shorter to build, a bit more health. And then Redeemer, slightly shorter, higher speed, higher health, but slightly nerfed transport capacity, whereas 10 was just a bit too much. So that's down to 8, but it should still be your main transport option. And Helios, again, speed and health buff. Just some minor buffs to most of the Land Raiders to make them a bit more useful, and also make some of the earlier ones, to make some of the cheaper ones a little bit more attractive. And that's it for those 2 patches. So, hopefully this was useful and informative. Next up will be Gene Stealer sub-factions are probably going to be the next major thing, as well as a few other interesting projects where we'll probably take a while before we release the next major patch. We might release another bug fix patch depending on how things go and how many bugs are found within this patch. But we do have multiple different major ambitious projects in the works, so it might take a while for us to get those sorted and out to you. So look forward to that, and I'll see you all later.